Good morning, everyone. Hello. I do not have much of a voice left after talking nonstop for 5 days at CBF. Plus, I think some of that Canadian smoke is making its way down to Georgia by now. Something was in the air, and yikes. But, you know, I love to talk to people, and I had way too much opportunity for too long. And this is what happens along the way. We had a great week at General Assembly, about 1,300 people there. Not as many Wilshire people there this year, just for various reasons. But D&G had a breakfast on Thursday morning with Jamar Tisby, who is professor at Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, author of the book The Color of Compromise. He's got another book coming out. Is a fabulous historian and really easy to listen to as well. So we had about 275 people at that breakfast. It was a very good time. Unfortunately, I didn't get anyone to video it, but there'll be a story about it. Anyhow, Baptist Women in Ministry celebrated their 40th anniversary. Big banquet, and they had like 700 people there for that. Lots of women everywhere in leadership at CBF. It's the anti-SBC, as we already know, but even more so.
I saw another church resign from the SBC.
Yeah, Elevation Church. Yeah. If you want to kick, go look up Elevation Church's website and watch some of their worship services. Okay, this is a guy named Stephen Furtick and his wife, Pastor Holly. Okay, so it's almost Pentecostal.
Oh, wow.
But not quite. So he is a Grammy Award-winning singer with a group. He's also a preacher. And he reminds me of a young Jimmy Swaggart. Because he just sort of flows from song to preaching, right? I mean, he does it all. He has a band behind him, and it's all that. Reach out and tell the person next to you God loves him. It's a little bit of black church, but he is not black. One of my black friends said, yeah, he acts like he's a black preacher. But his skin tone is such and his complexion is such that he looks indeterminate, right? And I think this allows you to get away with some stuff. I don't know. So yeah, they have 10,000 people on Sunday morning. So SBC is shedding more members. Most also significant, something happened at General Assembly this week, is the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists, the Gay Inclusive Fellowship Group, for the first time ever had an event on site at CBF General Assembly. It's always been off site. And not only, it was their 50th anniversary of existence. They mainly operated within the ABC, but they transcend denominational label. And the executive director of AWAB is a guy named Brian Henderson, who some of you will remember when Ann Jernberg left here to go to Denver to become co-pastor at Calvary Baptist Church there. Brian was her co-pastor. Oh. He later came out, is now pastor at First Baptist Denver, and Ann became senior pastor at Calvary. Brian's a great guy. And not only that, but there were, like, they had an overflow crowd there for that, and they gave their annual award to George, our George, for Wilshire's work in inclusion. And George had a beautiful response, very nice.
He's in the paper today.
Oh, he is?
Yeah, George, a big whole side.
What about him? Which part of it?
Just interviewing him and about the book.
Oh, the book. The book. Okay. Yeah. Did you know George has a book?
In today's paper, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, today's paper.
Today's Dallas Morning News?
Yeah.
Opinion page.
Okay, I brought it in from the curb, but I haven't looked at it yet.
And my name is not mentioned, but at the very end, it talks about something that might have embarrassed him or something funny. And remember when we had, the lights went out, everything went,
Right.
and we had to leave to go
Yes.
outside. And when we came in, he said, "Now, where were we?"
Come in.
And from the choir, I said, "We were at the end."
We were at the end.
It doesn't say my name, but that was me.
Was that you, Francis?
Okay.
When he said, "Where were we in the service?"
Yes,
I said,
I
"We
read
were
it.
at the end."
Yeah.
Very good. Well, I want to introduce you Andrew Gardner, who is in transit right now this summer from a postdoc. Is it? Yeah, a postdoc fellowship at Baylor. Andrew, did you do your undergrad at Wake or just your master's?
Just masters.
Okay. Where was your undergrad?
William and Mary.
Oh, yeah, that little school. Yeah, we've heard of that place. Yeah.
Very old.
Yeah. William and Mary, Wake Forest Divinity, student of Bill Leonard's, probably one of the last students of Bill Leonard's. Were you?
I think he had probably one. I mean, he's still teaching, but
Right.
He had one more year before he retired.
Before he actually retired, yeah. And then he's been doing serious, and along the way he's written for us at B&G and done some wonderful stuff. And he is on his way to LaGrange College in Missouri?
LaGrange, Georgia.
Georgia. Other LaGrange, okay. Oh, that's Hannibal LaGrange.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a different place. Yeah. Woo, sorry about that.
It's not LaGrange, Texas either.
Not LaGrange,
For other
Texas.
things.
So he's very good friends with Charlie and Cindy Fuller. Charlie's our interim minister of music. They dogs sit for each other. Andrew's dog's name is Walter. You need to see photos. Cutest dog almost ever, but way up there for sure. And he's written a new book as a historian that's the history of Binkley Memorial Baptist Church in North Carolina. And that's what he's going to talk to you. You may have never heard of this church. But it is important that you know this church because they really paved the way in many ways for where we are today. They were way ahead of all of us. I think that's safe to say, right? So Andrew's going to talk about that, answer your questions. I'm sure as a good professor, he's ready to handle anything you want to ask, right? Come on.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Yes, talk loudly, Andrew.
Yes, I will try and talk loud. I'll use my theater voice and project. So thank you all so much for, I think, Mark, for the invitation, and you all so much for being so gracious. Let me come and talk about my new book, Binkley, A Congregational History. I have copies if anyone's interested. But I'm more interested in talking about this church that is really did pave the way for a lot of progressive Baptist congregations and where progressive Baptists find themselves today. And so it is odd. I've given this a little bit a similar talk at Lakeshore. It's interesting to write a congregational history about a church and then go to other churches to tell them about that church. But Binkley, I think, is really interesting and really informative for some of the challenges that progressive churches can find. That some of the challenges I found that Binkley is having today, I hope can be helpful for other congregations to think about as they're entering into conversations about being welcoming and affirming, and etc. And so the big kind of takeaway, and I'll start from the beginning, I'll kind of give a rundown of just a brief history of kind of where the church is, why they are so unique, and feel free to ask questions if things don't make sense as we're going. And then we'll have some conversation afterwards. And so really, in terms of argument, in terms of how I framed thinking about this book for a wider audience, I thought a lot about consensus history. Does anyone has heard of consensus history? It's a fancy word from historiography, not that fancy, I guess, but it's a term used to talk about how history was done in the 20th century, early mid-20th century, that you started to have around the 1950s historians recognizing that white men weren't the only people you should write about when you write about history. And people were saying, well, you get into the 60s and you're like, well, we need to talk about the history of black individuals. And you have your core history and your core narrative of American history, and you're like, all right, white men, let's add on black history to that. And you still have that same core. You still have that same consensus. And then people are like, well, we haven't really talked about women. So you have women's history that's added onto that core. And you still have this consensus that is driven by white men and kind of that orientation to history of presidents and, people that kind of guided the way, American history unfolded. And you just added on additional groups as you're going. And it just became this consensus history. And what historians found was that means that none of those groups that are added on really change the narrative. That they're just added on. That they're just like, well, we'll have this section that adds on to our consensus. And this is what I really found working with Binkley and how Binkley addressed social issues. And so a little bit about Binkley Memorial Baptist Church. Has anyone heard of Binkley before? This is new? Okay, great. So it is a quirky, weird church. It was founded in 1958 in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And so at the time, the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is growing. This is post-World War II, GI Bill. A number of people are coming. The city is expanding, the college is expanding. And so Baptists say we need a new church in Chapel Hill. University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill is known for this type of Southern progressivism that is really accepting of academic freedom. And so in the 1920s, when there was all of this debate over whether or not Baptist colleges or any college could teach evolution, Scopes monkey trial, all that, University of North Carolina was like, nope, we can teach evolution, we can have this. It was this progressive Southern town that was open to new ideas. And the founders of Binkley said, we're going to found a church in the Southern progressive town that fits that bill. And so they went to have a number of conversations with prominent pastors in North Carolina, one of whom was Olin Binkley. Olin Binkley was a prominent Southern Baptist. He taught at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina, around the corner. And they really liked the way he wed academics, faith, kind of progressive ideas, Southern Baptist identity, and they really liked his kind of approach to the Baptist faith. And as they're going around having these conversations, they're going to think of a name, and they decide to name their church after Binkley, after Olin Binkley. And they go to approach him. This is one of the funny stories I found founding.
So he was still living.
He was still living at the time, and they go to him, and you can see in his own records that are in his archives that they asked him. They're like, "We'd like to name our church after you," and he has on like a 3x5 index card that is just scattered in his notes. A group came to meet with me and asked to name a church after me. I'm like quite perplexed by this. Like it was very confused. And he said he'd have to take some time to think about it. He did, and he got back with them, and then they were trying to figure out exactly how to name the church. Would it be Binkley Chapel Church, Binkley Memorial Baptist Church? There are a number of different suggestions. And he's the one that said in North Carolina he thought Memorial was more appropriate. So he had a church that was named after the Binkley Memorial Baptist Church when he was still alive. And he lived for another like 30 years after that, of having a church that was named in memorial for him. And so this church is founded wanting to be this Southern kind of progressive congregation. And immediately it starts to drift a little bit from where Binkley's comfortable with, the man. That they want to have an open membership policy in 1958, which means that they allow Methodists to join their congregation. Very, very scandalous. They want to let other, at the time, evangelical Christians to join without having to be rebaptized. And this causes them to be... they have to go on, as a congregation, watch care in the local association for 2 years before they're eventually denied from the local association membership, but are able to be involved in state Baptist life and the larger national Baptist life. And when they make this decision, Binkley the man actually sends a letter to Nashville headquarters for, I think at the time, the Sunday School Board.
Yep.
And he has a letter that says, "The church has just done this. I am in no way connected to this church. They just named it after me." Like, he was not really opposed. He always thought the church needed to do its own thing. That he didn't want to be the one that dictated what this church did when he wasn't a member. That it was a local church; they got to make their local decisions, even if it was named after him. But he wanted to cover his bases to let people in Southern Baptist life know that he was not in favor of an open membership policy. And so immediately, they have this kind of progressive identity. They're meeting on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill at that time, and they push things further within the first 3 months of existing, that they welcome their first black member, a black student, George Grigsby, who was a freshman at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, one of, I think, maybe 24 black freshmen at that time. Very, very few black students. This is, they're founded 4 years after Brown versus Board of Education in 1958, and so the University of North Carolina has not had black students for very long. And it takes the local paper a couple months before they realize that they need to cover this story of a black church that's interracial. Yeah.
What's the climate of the campus there at the time? Was it very progressive or was it very conservative?
That's a great question. And so they identified themselves as being very progressive. A lot of the black residents of Chapel Hill would say they were not very progressive. And so there's Chapel Hill's moniker that is coined in 1950 is the southern part of heaven. That moniker, someone writes a book about Chapel Hill as being the southern part of heaven, and it turns out that individual is a neo-Confederate. And so you can get a sense of his idea of what Chapel Hill is. That a number of black residents would come to refer to Chapel Hill as the southern part of hell because of the amount of discrimination. And so there's a lot of tension. There are ways in which Chapel Hill is very progressive and leading in terms of ideas of academic freedom. You do have a number of professors that are calling for integration of the school, but it tends to be that the school, as probably you all notice in many different parts around the country, the university is much more progressive than the town. And so Binkley, meeting on the campus, is positioning itself as that more progressive congregation. The church it's breaking away from at the time was Chapel Hill Baptist Church. Its concern over Binkley encroaching in on the territory, Chapel Hill Baptist Church will change its name to University Baptist Church. So University Baptist Church Chapel Hill exists today and is just off of the campus.
So what kind of percentage or what kind of grouping of the church? Was it mainly students or townspeople or a mix or?
It was a nice mix of a lot of different townspeople. It was a nice mix of townspeople, students, faculty, a good mix of people that really kind of identified with this Southern progressive mission that they were trying to start. And so they call a young pastor, Bob Seymour, and Bob Seymour is a Southern Baptist who didn't go to a Southern Baptist school. He chose to go to Yale Divinity School. Will Campbell, if anyone knows Will Campbell, the bootleg preacher who wrote the kind of really well-known memoir, Brother to a Dragonfly, was also a Yale Divinity School graduate. Yale was much more progressive than Southern Baptist schools. And Bob Seymour came to pastor Binkley. And Bob saw his role at Binkley as someone that was going to really try and shake up Chapel Hill. He had a new church that he had a lot of freedom to do, and shape that church as he wanted. And he identified civil rights as being what the church was really going to tackle in the 1960s. And so he would begin identifying people in the congregation to go out and do different missions in the church. He identified one man to go run for school board to help integrate the public school system, and that was his church work. He said, all right, your church work, you're going to go join the school board. We're not going to ask you to teach Sunday school. We're not going to ask you to serve on any committees. We're not going to ask you to, take up offering on Sunday mornings. No responsibilities. Your church work is just to run for school board. And he did, and he won, and he helped integrate the school system. The more well-known, I think, church work that he had was Dean Smith. If anyone likes college basketball, Dean Smith, native of Kansas, I believe, that came to the University of North Carolina. Dean Smith fell in love with Binkley, became a member. When Dean Smith became head coach of the basketball team, that day he got a call from Bob Seymour. Hey, your church work now is to integrate the UNC Tar Heels. Wow. And so it took him a couple years, but Dean Smith recruited Charlie Scott in '67, I believe. And in 1967, Charlie Scott came, or '66, Charlie Scott, a black basketball player, came to tour Chapel Hill on his visit. He didn't meet with Dean Smith much at all that weekend until Sunday, and Dean Smith invited him to church at Binkley. And Dean Smith used Binkley, I don't think used Binkley is the right word, but this was Dean Smith's kind of identity, that he attended this interracial church. He was going to invite Charlie Scott to come and experience what community could be like in Chapel Hill if Charlie Scott came, and he did, and integrated the first basketball team in North Carolina, or in the ACC, I should say at the time. And so civil rights, very important. So we have this kind of consensus that's a predominantly white congregation that's starting to involve people of color, starting to bring these, black individuals into the congregation. One black individual that would start to come was Howard Lee, who would go on to run for mayor of Chapel Hill, become the first black mayor of a southern town post-Reconstruction. And so within 10 years, Binkley goes from being this small church plant that is meeting on the College of University of North Carolina. They build a building, and within 10 years, they have the most recognizable basketball coach in the state attending their church, the mayor of Chapel Hill in their church, members of the school board in their church. They go from being this really small, quirky college town church to kind of being this established church in town. They're a place where, as one member told me when I was doing research, people knew that if trouble was going to happen in Chapel Hill, it would start at Binkley. And so this church becomes that type of kind of progressive congregation in town. And so following that, following the 60s, they think civil rights has passed, we're into the 70s, and the congregation begins addressing issues of women and women in ministry. And you see in 1968, the first chair of the diaconate is a woman. In the 70s, they call their first woman associate minister. They start to have questions about gender-inclusive language beginning in the 70s about, if we refer to God as He, that's, limiting for women to be able to imagine the divine and conceptualize the divine, that in the 70s they were having these questions about gender-inclusive language. It didn't always go well, that Bob Seymour, the pastor who was very progressive, also had some problems with some of this gender-inclusive language. He came around to it, but it took some time. That the church is moving through these issues. And so the 70s and 80s, the issue of women kind of becomes the issue of the church. Again, you see this consensus type of history. We have this idea we're going to attack the civil rights, we're going to attack gender, and then and the congregation keeps kind of building off of that kind of core center. And then the first instance where we get to see the conflict that happens with these types of overlapping social issues, this problem of thinking about this consensus history where we start with one thing and build on to other things, happens right after Bob Seymour retires. that Bob Seymour is a beloved pastor of the church. He helped found the church, gave a guiding vision for the church. He's there for 30 years. He helps them through building projects and a number of other really kind of controversial issues around race and gender. He retires, and then they call their first woman senior pastor. And Linda Jordan is who they call. It's a tense transition, because you have someone like Bob Seymour, who is beloved, 30 years there. He is the father of a nuclear family, boy and girl. His wife played the piano. Very kind of quintessential, kind of what you think of as like 1950s pastor, although progressive. And Linda Jordan comes, and Linda Jordan is a single woman who is living with another woman, raising that woman's daughter. The church even asks in the call process if she's gay. She is not. And so there's already some tension in terms of thinking about sexuality when she's called to the pastorate. And she's called in 1990, and within about 6 months, a young divinity student from Duke Divinity School comes to Linda. He's been attending Binkley for a while, and he's saying, "I'd love for you all to ordain me." The man is John Blevins, young divinity student who is openly gay. And so Linda, who is coming into this new church, taking on a role that is very difficult to inherit a role after a pastor like Bob.
We know something about that.
Linda's coming in, and you have someone who approaches her that is essentially like throwing a grenade. Would you ordain me as an openly gay man? Linda takes it to the diaconate. Initially, the diaconate is like, of course, we know John, we love John, but you start to see some people on the diaconate that are like, wait, we need to study this issue. And so they begin to study issues of sexuality over a year. They have Sunday school classes that are addressing this. Linda gives 4 sermons that are addressing sexuality and faith, and how sexuality is part of all of our experiences in the early 1990s. And the congregation begins to have 2 sides that form. You can see it happening, that there are people that are not engaging this process, that are not interested in this process. And in 1992, when the diaconate votes to bring it forward to the whole church, all hell breaks loose. And the church has there's a number of great sources, because the church had an open forum, really, that people could submit open letters. And so in some ways, great for me as a historian, in some ways probably not the best way of handling this, that people get to just go in with all of their opinions wide-eyed. And one of the elements that challenges this in Linda's leadership more than anything is that Bob stays in the congregation. That Bob is there throughout this entire process, looming very large. That when the congregation gives resources out, they give a number of resources of things that have been written about sexuality and faith, and they also give Bob's sermon on homosexuality from 1983, but don't include any of Linda's sermons from earlier that year. Bob is also there glad-handing in the narthex after service before Linda can get back there to greet people. And Bob he's a beloved pastor, very gregarious. He was very successful at his job because of how social and relational he was. But his position in the church at that time was really, I think, inhibited Linda's leadership. And ultimately, the church does take a vote. They vote to affirm John and to license him. It's a small detail that I really hate about the story, because it's very confusing. Has anyone heard of licensing? Oh, okay, good. All right, so you all know licensing. Every time people that don't know about licensing, I'm like, this is going to take at least 15 minutes. But it's just kind of the step before ordination. John hadn't finished his divinity degree at the time. He didn't have a call to ministry, so they voted to license him rather than ordaining him. Most of the people in the congregation probably didn't see much of a distinction between those two positions at that time. They vote. About 30 families leave the congregation. I'd say close to 30% or 40% leave Binkley. And Linda also ends up leaving Binkley shortly thereafter. That as she's having conversations about this, there's an episode she recounts to me that Bob came to her office one day and was talking with her, and Bob just flat out said, "I'll always be pastor of this church." And she said, "I believe you." And she very jokingly said, but she was like, these are the words. She remembers that moment so vividly. She just said, "I believe you." And she made her moment to leave Binkley at that time. And she stayed, I think, a couple years after and left in '94. But that's the first moment you start to see issues of sexuality and issues of gender come in conflict with one another. That the congregation in the 1990s 100% thought this was only an issue of sexuality that they were dealing with. They thought that they had already dealt with issues of gender. They thought that they had dealt with them in the 70s and 80s. They loved, women in ministry, great, rah, rah, rah. We have our pastor, Linda Jordan. They did not think of the ways in which gender and a woman's leadership was also going to come in conflict with taking on a decision like that. That you see this parallel, this conflict. Of overlapping, of looking at this consensus history where we tackle an issue one at a time, and then what happens when issues overlap. How do we know how to tackle an issue when it's intersecting, when things are not always clear-cut? And so you have that issue in the 1990s. The next pastors that come in are from American Baptist Life. They pastor a little differently. They open the doors, I think, a little bit more to congregational leadership. The church is in a little trauma. It's kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1992.
Before it was cool to be kicked out.
Before it was cool. Binkley sets the precedent. So, Binkley sets the precedent for what happened a couple weeks ago.
Right.
The first time the SBC Constitution was changed in terms of membership, I believe, was in '92 when the SBC voted Binkley out, and then they immediately voted to change the Constitution. That friendly cooperation was limited to churches that opposed homosexuality. Today, amendment, friendly cooperation is those that oppose women. And in '93, an amendment was posed to do the same thing that happened this is getting in the weeds. '92 opposed women, congregations that approved of homosexuality were kicked out. In '93, there was an amendment to oppose congregations that ordained women that failed. That is now what we see 30 years later today. Again, seeing the overlap of these issues, women and sexuality, that are still today. That what's happening today is very much wrapped up in sexuality. And so following this, after the church makes this decision, essentially they put up a flag for all people in the surrounding community that says, hey, this is a church that is welcoming and affirming. This is a church that's going to ordain you, care for you, whatnot. And so they get quite a few LGBTQ individuals to come join, but they get a lot of other people joining from congregations that have issues that are important to them that they know would get an audience at Binkley. And so you start to see an explosion of health ministries, progressive people that are doing like New Age healing, people that are interested in Israel-Palestine, people that are interested in the environment, people that are interested in all of these social issues that are very much like deep and meaningful to them, that know that they won't get an audience at their congregation that they're at, but that they get an audience at Binkley. And Binkley gets all of these issues coming in. And so after this, you have a lot of different kind of conflicts and jostling as different issues are coming into conflict with one another, because church budgets only go so far. People only have so much time in their lives to give to so many different issues and causes. And when everyone is approaching it based upon piecemeal their individual kind of issues, it's hard to see the ways in which there are overlap and connections. And so this continues, And I'll conclude just comments, and we can open up for conversations and questions with an issue that I conclude in the book that happens in 2013. And so we see, again, a coming together of two issues. That in 2013, Binkley has a divinity school intern that comes, who is a Ray Speller. He is a black divinity student at Duke who comes. He's from a Pentecostal background, more conservative. He comes to Binkley, and Binkley absolutely loves him. He's not sure his first 2 weeks. I spoke with him. His first 2 weeks, he wasn't sure whether or not he could stick it out in this predominantly white, but still had, some black individuals present in the congregation. It was predominantly white. He wasn't sure if he could stick it out in this white liberal congregation. But he does. He falls in love with the church falls in love with him. He explains speaking in tongues to the church in ways that resonate with Binkley. He's able to connect ideas of his Pentecostal upbringing with their progressive ideas. Great candidate. He does his year-long internship. He stays after for his third year of divinity school when he doesn't have to, and he asks for ordination. And he goes up for ordination. The ordination council is going through everything, and by the time they get to the end of the ordination process, as the ordination council, there's a member of Binkley that says, "What are your opinions on same-sex marriage, sexuality, homosexuality?" And Ray Speller, being very honest, says, I was raised in a conservative black Pentecostal household. I've gone to Duke, I've been here. I'm still figuring that out. I'm not sure where I stand on things right now. Very honest with this congregation that he's been involved in. He's clearly ministered to LGBTQ individuals while he's been at Binkley. And this sends up some red flags for one member of the ordination council. The ordination council, they begin to have a lot of fear and agitation that what's going to happen is going to be the same thing that happened with John Blevins, the gay divinity student in '92. That this is going to be the same instance where something's going to happen and people are going to leave the church. It's going to fracture. It's going to be a real conflict. And as they're going through things, they put a pause on the ordination and eventually say, "It may be best, Ray, if you withdraw your ordination request." And so Ray withdraws his ordination request. In some ways, he remains a fan of Binkley, but kind of knocked the dust off his shoes. Went on to, I believe, historic Concord Baptist Church in New York, a historic black Baptist church in New York, for an internship. Is ordained there and is now in the UCC. But Binkley had to navigate on from that. There was no fracture, but the congregation did bring in a consulting group to help them wrestle and go through kind of the trauma of that experience for them, when really it was their inability to see the intersection of race and sexuality and be able to wrestle with those issues in ways that help see the complexity of Ray's background as someone who grew up in a historically black Pentecostal conservative church, to be able to see how he was having to wrestle with sexuality that would be different than the ways in which the white membership of Binkley were wrestling with sexuality. And so again, you see this challenge of Binkley had this triumphal progressive history marching on and adding all these different issues in, that when they come into conflict with one another, they don't know what to do. And so that's really, I think, the story of Binkley that I think resonated with the University of Tennessee Press to want to tell the story, to publish it, but also has resonated, I think, with a number of people who have said, "Andrew, you should go to other churches to talk about this." Other churches would find this interesting and it would be helpful for them to think about. And so that's, I think, some of the story that I have. I have some questions for you all to think about, but I'm also open for questions that you all have about this narrative or other things about Binkley. Yeah.
Referencing on-campus churches makes me wonder, is 7th and James still there, and is it SBC?
Seventh and James is still, and they actually voted at
Waco.
Waco, yeah, Seventh and James Waco, which is just across the street from Tidwell Hall, where the religion department is. I park at Seventh and James all this year. But yes, they are no longer SBC. They are CBF, and I believe within the last 6 months, they voted to become welcoming and affirming.
Their pastor was in General Assembly this week. Yes, I talked to him.
Gotcha.
So I think there had been a couple of holdouts in their church that they were waiting for that just waited and then happened.
But what's interesting about that is, have they been kicked out or have they left BGCT?
I don't see. I was telling someone earlier. I'm a Virginia Baptist.
Yeah, I think they're still a BGCT.
Or I grew up Virginia Baptist, I should
Right,
say.
yeah.
So I don't know Texas Baptist, the politics as
Oh,
much,
okay.
but I don't know if they've been officially kicked out or not.
Yeah.
I imagine they have not yet.
Well, this is getting way down a well, but there's a carve out right now for some Waco churches because of Truett Seminary.
Yeah. Lakeshore is not part of that carve out.
Oh, right, yeah, already gone. Right. Yeah. I want to point out a couple things. This is such a profound presentation.
Wait a minute, Mark, do you need to go on the camera?
It usually can pick me up.
Okay.
I'm loud. So many parallels almost to our story. We've had 2 long-term pastorates, 30 and 33 years, right? So we know what that's like. We've not had that dysfunction of transition. But we've also dealt with difficult issues. I think we have the scars to prove for that too, in our own way. But the thing that just jumps out at me from this story is, no, it's fine, Jim, it's fine.
We're just going to turn on you.
I really didn't want
And then we'll turn it. We got to see you.
Okay.
We'll turn it back.
The thing that jumps out at me from this story is you have a long-term male pastor who is progressive in every way, but doesn't understand he's still so got to be in charge. He cannot let a woman have leadership. And this is happening at a time when this female pastor has very few other options on churches to go to. You've got to understand the context. It's not like if this were a male pastor and they're having a bad experience, they could just go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. It would be very hard for her to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right.
And the one thing that I'll say for Bob, and Bob he passed away last year, or 2 years ago now. But he passed away, and he stayed in that congregation until he passed away. And he got along better with some of the other pastors, and there are other reasons for that. And I think, I got a chance to talk to Bob on a couple occasions. I didn't get a chance to talk to him about this particular issue. I got a chance to talk to Bob about all the good stuff Bob did. I didn't get a chance to talk to him about all the stuff that I found a little nefarious that Bob did. And there are some other things in there. And so, and for him, it was very easy. Binkley Memorial Baptist Church was also kicked out with Binkley for having a same-sex union in '92. It is right down the street in Raleigh. Watt Street Baptist Church is down the street in Durham. Addie Davis was ordained there as the first New Southern Baptist ordained woman. Could have easily gone to Watt Street. There were a number of churches in the area that he could have gone to. It is not like it was a church that was a progressive congregations isolated. I can think of a couple off top of my head, Monroe, Louisiana. What's that church name? I can't remember. But there are a couple churches that I can think of that. All right, I could understand there may not be another place you could really go.
Right.
But you'd have to deal with that issue as it comes up, and there are different dynamics, different personalities for all these issues. Yeah.
Well, and another thing that strikes me also is you're describing such specific decisions being made that have such sweeping repercussions in so many other areas. That's the Supreme Court today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, thinking about the Supreme Court decision and all the stuff with affirmative action, particularly seeing the ways in which, I think the New York Times had a piece today about medical school, I think UC Davis, that has been doing a social economic scale, and it has become one of the most diverse medical schools in the country that really weighs heavily social economics. So again, the way in which class and race overlap. And that's one thing that a lot of progressive congregations, I think, struggle with, is that that they tend to be well educated, they tend to be affluent congregations in terms of seeing class, and the intersection of that is difficult. Yeah.
The thing that jumped out for me in your discussion was the last part, where, you know, I think I know I do pat myself on the back sometimes as a white little woman, you know, about how progressive I am. But then, because of your progressiveness, you can't see someone struggling and growing in their understanding of the Bible or their faith or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
According to you, anyway, a legitimately wonderful person that everyone loved, and I think I have that blind spot.
Yeah,
You know, because I'm starting to think, well, what would I do? I might have been that person that raised, you know, like, we've already gone through this whole thing on LGBT, you know, like,
yeah, and it's the challenge is it's very difficult to address every issue all at once.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to do that. So organizationally, it makes sense that congregations would address issues one at a time and go on that march of, all right, we're going to talk about this now, we're going to move before, but that raises that question of what happens when you have to go back, when you have to take steps back to kind of, you have to straddle parts of your history that you think have been
So does intersectionality, which, you know, is a new way of thinking to me, to, see, I think we're taught in our education system to be pretty linear, you know, especially lawyers, and, you know, so do you think I wouldn't have happened if they had tackled the race stuff too, or they probably thought they already had?
I think they probably thought they had already tackled the race stuff in some ways. I think they thought they had already, that they thought they were at a particular point in their history where these were the only candidates that they could ordain, people that checked all of the boxes, not people that were still on the journey of figuring out those boxes. When Ray's background meant that he would address each of those boxes in a different order.
Right.
Whereas they didn't have to, they could address those boxes in the order they wanted to.
Right.
Where Ray would address them in different orders.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think one of the scariest things happening today is this Moms for Liberty group that's organizing. I don't know if y'all seen the news about it, but they're trying to limit what kind of textbooks are going to be used in classrooms. And they're organizing in many, many cities trying to infiltrate school boards.
Yeah.
And I think they're also associated with the group, the Proud Boys.
Yes.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So the concern was about the Moms for Liberty group and what they're doing in terms of classrooms and public school classrooms, going to school boards, textbooks, all that. Yeah, it is, and I think in some ways the Binkley history for me, it shows that liberal congregations can also address those schools. That Bob Seymour was, he said, hey, Fred Ellis, you've got 4 girls in the public school system at every level. You should run for school board. Fred Ellis did, and was on the school board making changes. So there are ways in which progressive congregations can still mobilize to kind of combat this, but it does need to be combated.
What is the state of the congregation today in 2023? How are they doing?
Oh yeah, so Binkley today. So today I was just there about a month ago to present the book. I think they're doing really well. So they're in the midst of some staff transition right now. Their numbers are definitely have dwindled from probably their peak attendance. I mean, their peak attendance was probably right before the licensure conflict in the early 90s. But their attendance is pretty good. They're doing a lot with Black Lives Matter and have a lot of people join in the pandemic because they've held, I think it's weekly Black Lives Matter vigils right outside their church on a really prominent thoroughfare in Chapel Hill, and they've got a lot of members who join from that.
Who is their pastor now?
Marcus McFall, who was at University Baptist or First Baptist Austin. He was in Austin for a while, then was an interim for a while.
Wasn't first, I don't think.
Okay, he was in Austin for some time. Haven University.
What is the orthosis? You said they peaked in the 90s and then dwindled. And you also said that 30%.
Yeah.
lost during
So I think I would say probably in the early 90s they were about 300-400, about that range, and now probably I think when I was there was about 150 on Memorial Day weekend, so the weekend when a lot of people were absent. So I'd say probably around 200 active any given Sunday. So. Small church. So the one thing I will say, Texas has skewed your perspectives. The median church size of all churches in the United States is 65. The middle. Half of congregations in the United States are less than 65 people.
Really?
Mainline congregations, the median is 50. Half of mainline congregations are less than 50 people. Half are more than 50.
How are the churches supported? I mean, with 50 members, how do they support a pastor
They have
and
one staff member. They have one staff member.
One staff member. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then what was the one other statistic I was going to say? And so, in terms of 200, on the scale of American congregations, they're a large congregation.
Just not in Texas.
So just not in Texas.
Yeah.
I don't know what I have to ask Scott Thummel if he could break it out by Texas.
I bet he could. Yeah, I've not seen that, but that'd be interesting. Yeah. Everything's bigger in Texas.
Yeah.
All these mega churches everywhere.
I saw I think it was a meme on Facebook today that was like, this is how big Texans think Texas is. It was like Texas and then like the United States was like, and someone had put under there, no, Texas is too small in that photo.
Okay, we need to. Yeah. Let me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. Excellent. All right. I'll just pop in here real quick and say to those online, thank you. So, where can people buy this book if they're not here?
If you're not here, the University of Tennessee Press.com and use code Binkley and you get 20% off.
So, University of Tennessee Press, use the code Binkley. That's Binkley.
It's on the cover of the book too.
Oh yeah, you can see it. Right? Yeah, I feel like a televangelist. Call me daddy. 20% off.
Exactly.
We'll send you a prayer cloth with it. Yeah. So Andrew, and y'all, this is a delight because Andrew's one of the up and coming young historians who you're going to be hearing about for a long time, and so many parallels that are instructive to us in this story as well. I've got other things to tell you about that as well. Thank you all for your gracious reception here. Let's pray together, and then Charlene's going to come and give us an update offline about our members in need. Thank you, God, for this day and for the story of your grace among others. And we pray that you would help us to learn as we go and to keep changing and growing with your grace. We pray through Jesus Christ. Amen.